coloured illustration. So you should have something using line to start with. So you want a very basic outline or some shading with line, but you definitely need something that's got outlines to start with. You're also going to need a colour scheme, so you're going to need to figure out what colours you want to use. So for that, I tend to use a website called Canva Colours. You could use Adobe Colours. There's other websites called like Coolors, whatever you want to use basically. I find this one is my favourite. So you can go to the colour wheel and make your own colour scheme, but I find it just as easy to use these existing ones here. And you just want to find something that you think is going to work for you. Once you've got something that you fancy, that you like the look of, select it and then go for a screenshot like that. Now I've got one that I have already picked, so I'm going to find my existing screenshot. So I've got this one here that I want to use. Okay. Now I'm going to put that onto its own layer actually. So I'm going to make a new layer, find the thing that I've just dropped in and pop that on there. Now I want to make this into swatches, so I can't use these colours until they're in my swatches panel. So for that I need to use my eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to eyedrop these colours, open my swatches panel, and if I just make this a little bit bigger, you can actually just drag these and you see it gives you a plus symbol. So I'm going to do that for all 4 colours. And there we go. So now they're in my swatches panel and they're there ready to go. Now, I want my colour on its own layer, so I'm just going to work on this layer. And I want to make sure all my line work, especially my outline, is on the outside. I'm going to hide that layer because I don't want that one. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Blob brush tool. So, like before, I want to make sure that I've got my settings here, I've got it smooth. I'm going to go thicker because I'm going to be colouring in, so I kind of want a decent amount of size there to work with. Now obviously my object, really the only thing that's a different colour is going to be the teeth, so depending on what your illustration is of, you might have lots of sections that are going to be different colours, or you might have sort of a flat base layer. Now you want to work in 3 tones, so you want to work in base colour, highlights and shadows. So for the base colour, all we're going to do, and we want to make sure our outline is on the top, we want to lock those, make sure we're on this layer underneath, and I'm just going to go through with my pen. Now that's not the colour I wanted. I want this purple colour, pink colour. Select that one. And then we should be good to go. Now I'm just going to do this quite roughly in the middle because I've got quite a large area to colour. Obviously, if you're working with something that's got smaller areas to cover and smaller sort of sections that want to be in different colours, you're going to need to work a lot more carefully. So I'm not very zoomed in at the moment. I'm just covering this general area. You can see it takes a second just to catch up with me, and you want to make sure you're getting everything and it's all nice and evenly coloured. And then what we'll do is we're going to make separate layers and we're going to put the highlights and shadows on top of this base layer. So making sure you've got your base layer covered. Now you can see there I've just gone over the edge a little bit, so I'm going to show you how we can fix that later. For now I just want to get this blanket sort of layer down. Okay. Now you can see I've got to a point where I need to be getting closer to the edges, I need to be doing it a bit neater. So I'm going to zoom in for this. Now you could at this point make your brush smaller, and again I'm going to hold my button down on my pen so that I can pan across my screen. Now this is where you just want to be a little bit more neater, a little bit more careful. Now this black line is going to go on top, so it doesn't matter if we go over the black line a little bit, but you really want to make sure that you do go up to it and that you don't go too far over it. Now you can see I've not quite gone up to it there, so I'm just going to do that. And just go around your edges and just make sure those are nice and neat. I would never start quite on the edge, I would start in the middle and work out to it, and that helps you get an idea of the size of your brush, rather than clicking too close to the edge and ending up with a really big brush that automatically goes over. So like that. And you'll see because the outline is on top, it just automatically sort of neatens it up, even though it doesn't look amazing when you first do it. Because that outline is on top and because that layer is locked, this is going to start looking a lot nicer and a lot neater. So it's basically just like colouring in any other way that you would. Obviously, we've only got a very flat colour here, so I'm going to talk to you about how you can jazz that up a little bit. And you can see I've gone over the edge ever so slightly there. Let's do it roughly on this bit. Missed a bit there, so I'm going to colour that bit in. Now if you do go over the edge like I've done there, we can just get the eraser tool. Because we've got our sort of like black line on the outline protecting us, it's quite easy just to go in with the eraser tool. This is why having an outline is really important. If you don't have that outline, this is going to be a much harder process. So there we go, so I can just erase that, erase any other little bits or mistakes that I've made along the way. So there's a tiny little bit there. And I think that is us ready to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my highlights and I'm going to do my shadows. So I'm just going to zoom out for you. I'm going to do them using the Blob brush tool again. And I'm going to have, so I'm going to swap back to my mouse a minute. I'm just going to rename that layer as base. Add a new layer over the top, so I've locked that layer. So remember, if you're not using a layer, have it locked. You don't need to be able to access it if you're not using it, so lock it, and it'll just make your workflow a lot easier and a lot quicker. I'm then going to open my colour guide window, so I need that open, and I'm going to drop that just into here. Now when I open my colour guide, you can see it gives me shades, so that is the colour I'm working with now. So if I wanted to do a highlight, I could go one colour above. If I wanted to do a shadow, I can go one colour down. So I'm going to go one colour down, and I'm just going to make my blob brush, so I'm going to make sure that's on my outline. So if you see if I do that, then it's there, whereas if I do that, it doesn't quite work. So make sure that I'm on my new layer, which I'm going to call shadow. I might make my blob brush a little bit smaller, so I might go down to 15 maybe. And then I'm going to go in and add in that shading. Now I can do this in several different ways. So I could do this as sort of block shapes. So I could block in a whole area that I want to do it in. And again, because we've got our black lines, this should look fairly neat. Like so. So here we're not trying to get sort of brush strokes or brush lines, we're just going for a flat area. And again, because this is on its own layer, if there's anything that we need to erase or get rid of, we can, because it's on its own layer, so it's not going to affect anything else. So we can use the eraser tool if we need to. There we go. Now, for these more complicated bits, again, I'm just going to sort of sketch those in quite roughly. So I'm doing these as sort of like block shapes. So I'm trying to block out the areas where I want it to be darker. Go. So it's not perfect, but we'll leave it like that for now. And again, for these bits, I'm just going to roughly sort of estimate a shape. I could just leave it as a sort of block line like that. And there we go. Like so. If I zoom out, you can see we've got some fairly convincing shading. Now it's a little bit blocky for my liking. So I'm going to show you with the highlight, the alternative. So this is where actually having our outline and our detail from our line work stage really comes into play. So I could get rid of that, and you can see I've got a much sort of flatter image. And I could have, if I hide this shadow and do an alternative sort of shadow, I could actually take this layer, select everything that's on that layer. So if I unlock it and click there, then I select all of that. Then I could choose from my colour guide, I could choose my darker colour. And if I swap those round and take the outline off, you should see that all of that sort of sketching that I did in that sort of details period of time now is in that darker colour. So I could then move that down below my outline, and you can see I get this sort of sketched in shadow area. So you could do line sketching, and again, if I sort of bring that other sort of level in there, you can see we can do different layers, so we can do different amounts, different darknesses. If I go back to my blob brush tool and I go to my colour guide, if I go to a new layer for my highlights here, and we'll put this in between these two. Now I want to select that colour to start with, my base colour, and then you can see it gives me a lighter version. And again, I could do the same thing. So thinking about where my lighter areas are, I could go in just with some little lines. It's almost as if you were just sort of colouring it in. Now obviously if you wanted it to be a bit more dramatic, you could go the next colour up. You could go for thinner lines and do a bit more shading than this, but I'm not really worried too much about that. So you can see we're starting to add some shadows and we're adding some highlights in as well. So just picking out those sort of opposite areas where you know it's lighter and the shadow isn't hitting it as much. Now obviously you could do that as those block shapes. We could hide those block shapes, so we could just have sort of the lines on there. So there's two different line effects. It's totally up to you. I could put the detail layer back into black so that we've got the detail on top of the shadow. So we can go back to our original black layer there. So it is totally up to you how you want this to work. Obviously, if I'd have filled in the teeth, I might have done the teeth grey with then a white highlight or a slightly darker grey on the edge. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a quick background in just so you can start to see how all of that would look together. There we go. Now if I just go to my lovely green colour that I've got there, blob brush, I'm going to make my brush bigger. Remember, if you're not using the layers, lock them. There we go, and that is our quick background layer. So nice and simple. So using the blob brush again to add either sections of colour or coloured lines to add shadows and highlights, adding a background in. Obviously it could be a flat background, it could be a gradient background, it could be a pattern background, whatever you want it to be. I've just done that nice and quick. Now I'm actually going to hide these, and I'm going to show you a slightly different way to do that shadow and texture. So if you're wanting a more sort of cartoony style, so less hand-drawn and more sort of blocked out, I'm going to select all of this base area here, so this block colour that I put down to start with. I'm going to use a shape builder, and because that's all I've got on my layer, I'm just going to sort of get all of that stuff together. So I'm just clicking and I'm drawing over, because this is the only thing on the layer. It doesn't really matter where we go, we're just trying to get all of these bits of the pink base colour to become one shape. So you can see, then I can do that, Go over the bits I've missed. Now, for this, we're going to use the knife, so it needs to be one collective shape. So if you've got an area of colour, it might just be, you know, if you're doing someone in clothing, it might just be the main area of the t-shirt or the sleeve or whatever you're doing. You need to make sure all of that is one sort of flat shape. So if you've done it with the blob brush tool, it might have generated lots of different shapes if you've taken your pen off at any point. So just go through, use the shape builder tool. Again, this is why it's really important to have things in separate layers, because this would be impossible to do if you'd got thousands and thousands of stuff all on one layer. So making sure you've got your layers there, making sure you know where they are and can access them and that you've labelled them. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to stop talking about this now. So now I've got one sort of consistent shape. I'm going to duplicate that. So I'm just going to drag it down to the plus tool here and duplicate it, lock my original. Again, if it's not in use, have it locked. And then I'm going to go and find my knife tool. So it's under the eraser. Now you could do this with a pen if it feels more comfortable. I'm just going to do it with my mouse tool, and I just want to sort of go over the bits that I want to have a highlight on it. And you need to make sure it cuts across, so you need to go all the way across and out. So like we did the overlap with our previous sort of example, now I'm going to select that bit that's on its own. And again, if I go to my colour guide, I can then turn that into a highlight, so I can take that lighter. So I'm just going to go and do this. Now you'll see it sort of magnetises. So if I wanted to do that, it will pretty much join up with the line that I drew to start with. It's not perfect, but it should do it. And then I've joined that up, and then I go back and I will select that bit out, double click it, and I want that to be a shadow. So I'm going to go 2 darker. No, actually that's a bit dark, so I'm going to go 1 darker. There we go. So you can see that's given us a section of shadow. So if you wanted to do it that way, if you want a more cartoon sort of effect and you want it to be these block areas of colour rather than that sort of sketched in style that we did with the blob brush tool, you can do it this way. So using the knife tool, always have it as a copy and pasted layer, so you don't want to be doing it to your original base colour, just in case anything goes wrong. And we can do it that way. So you could do it with, in theory, with the pen tool and go around and make these shapes, but actually that knife tool works fairly well to go around and make these sort of shaded areas, and it sort of magnetises to your original lines, which is quite nice. You need to make sure you clearly overlap when you join it back up together, otherwise it won't recognise it as its own shape. Use your colour guide here to select a darker version, and it's as easy as that. Okay, so you can use a blob brush tool, so like we did on our first version. So if I had that one, to add blocked colours in, or you can use it to do those sort of line sort of sketched effects like we did with the original details. Pick an interesting colour scheme. It doesn't have to be the colour of the thing you're drawing. Obviously schools aren't bright pink. You know, this is the part of being an illustrator where you start to choose your own style and you try to change it from the original photograph or the original sort of thing that you're working with. So you're starting to add your own influence here. If you're interested in looking at more advanced techniques, check out the videos on texture and adding things like noise and grain, and that will really start to push. You could start to add gradients to some of these things. So if I select this shape here, so if I just unlock my shadow layer, if I wanted to make this a little bit more subtle, again, obviously I would need this to be one individual shape. So if I select those two and just shape builder those together, so I've got one flat shape. You could then start to add a gradient. So we could go for our gradient, and I can see it's going from black. So actually I just want that to be transparent, and I want it to be that colour, and then I want that to be that colour and not transparent. So then you can see we can start to have it sort of fade in, so it looks a little bit more realistic rather than just one big block. So you could start to do that, but obviously you need one flat shape for that. So again, you'd have to use that shape builder to merge together all of those areas that you've drawn. Do the same thing for there, and just change the amount. So plenty of things you can be starting to do, either using the knife tool on a sort of copied and pasted version, or using the blob brush tool to draw those in. Make sure you've got that colour guide window open. It will give you that top row of different shades, and that will make it really easy to do your highlights and shadows with.